Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin, South Africa and the world's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. In this show, we gather a panel of brilliant South Africans who live scattered around the world to discuss the most important South African and global news stories and ideas of this week. What a show we have ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about the dog that didn't bark at the ANC's National General Council, China's record good trade surplus, the move away from the dollar as the global reserve currency, private equities decline, the DA leadership struggle, the ANC not paying its staff, the common ground between the ANC and DA voters, and the shift in the American national security strategy. But before we get to any of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans from across the globe. Joining us from Germany, where he is pivoting German foreign policy towards the West, the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Konrad Adenauer of Achim, James Myburgh. From Germany, we are off to the United Kingdom, where we find our UK correspondent launching the British Navy to retake the Falklands. He is the Margaret Thatcher of Marylebone, Simon Lincoln Reader. And we are finally off to South Africa, from where we are joined by the Common Sense's editor, who is uniting the four colonies into one union. He is the founder of Frans Cronje Private Clients, the Louis Botha of Blair Gowrie, Frans Cronje. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, ingeniously paying the Mauritians to take the Chagos Islands from me, the Keir Starmer of Kirstenbosch, Gabriel Makin. So, gentlemen, I think the best place to start is at home, and we'll start with you, James, because we had the ANC's National General Council this week, and something pretty significant didn't happen. So, can you tell us all about that, please?
Sure. There's a sort of background to this, and basically, the background was, in the mid '90s and 1990s onwards, Thabo Mbeki became more and more powerful in the ANC and more powerful over South Africa, and he started, he dominated the ANC, dominated government. Basically, everyone became a bit scared of him. And he went into the 2004 election, came out with almost a 70% majority. And the economy was doing very well. He seemed totally entrenched and unchallenged. And then in 2005, Jacob Zuma's sort of sugar daddy, who was Shabir Sheikh, got tried and prosecuted and then convicted for his corrupt relationship with Jacob Zuma. And this was sort of interpreted at the time as Zuma had got a bit too big for his boots, and this was the way of removing Zuma from contention. And then in June 2005, the National Prosecuting Authorities announced that Zuma now would have to be prosecuted for the other side of that corrupt relationship with Sheikh. And Zuma was sacked from government, and he was then forced to step down from all party structures, although he kept the title of ANC deputy president. So it very much looked as if Zuma was finished, the Mbeki juggernaut was rolling on. And then there was a National General Council scheduled for early July. And at the National General Council, the mood of the delegates from from most of the provinces was in favor of Zuma. And they were saying, Zuma is our president, and they literally forced Mbeki to reinstate Zuma to his party position. And from that moment on, Mbeki was almost a dead duck. The door was wide open for Zuma to then challenge him and win the ANC presidency in 2007 at Polokwane. And now, that was the start of that contest. So from being this absolutely dominant figure within the ANC, within government, within South Africa, suddenly Mbeki lost all his authority at the National General Council through this revolt of the delegates. Now, now we turn to the present, and something very interesting didn't happen at this National General Council, because if we go back, last year in the formation of the Government of National Unity, I think there was a lot of sort of unease and unhappiness within the ANC at the idea of doing a deal with the enemy, the Democratic Alliance. And I think that I think at certain stages, I don't know quite how the Schlente worked, but they weren't, the ANC leadership weren't even sure that they could get, the GNU through the ANC National Executive Committee. So what happens at this National General Council? Well, the big thing that happens is nothing. There's no grassroots revolt against this this government of national unity. It seems to have just sort of passed through without much debate. Zuma's not, Ramaphosa is not forced to back down or anything. So it's a sort of quite an interesting indication of the adaptation of the ANC to this very strange thing called the government of national unity, with your sort of the person you frame as your enemy, which is the Democratic Alliance. So that was quite a big story of a dog that doesn't bark, something that doesn't happen. It very much, this would have been the moment when the party would have said, enough, we don't want this deal, but they didn't. So that I think is a sign, perhaps, that the GNU has sort of now got basic acceptance within the ANC. I mean, if it can get through the NGC, that's a big deal, because that's as wide as it gets before you get to as high as you get before you get to the national conference itself. Yeah, so then that also leads to this the next question, which is, John Steenhuisen, whose position within the Democratic Alliance is, from all accounts, quite precarious at the moment. And he, I suppose he should get some credit for making this thing work. And he's currently being, hammered for various things about his personal life. He's always been hammered for only having a matric, never getting to, getting a university degree. The EFF have had, great fun over the years going after him for that. But on the other hand, it's not that's not propaganda that gets under people's skin. The traditional thing about the DA, the allegation that's always been about the DA and its leaders, or its white leaders, is that they're arrogant, and they look, the propaganda that line that works against the DA is, well, they think they're better than you, these people. And now the other propaganda is, John Steenhuisen only has a matric, and then 90% of the population also only has a matric. Or that he's struggling, he struggled with his finances. Well, that's 90% of the population is also struggling with their finances, and I think probably half the cabinet as well. So that's the sort of and somehow Steenhuisen sort of made the sort of, he hasn't provoked any allergic reaction in the ANC that would have led to the sort of expulsion of the DA, regardless of the consequences. On the other hand, I think the downside of that is certainly in the early stage of the GNU, he was, the ANC were walking all over the DA. They were pushing through the Bela Act. They were pushing through the Expropriation Act. And I suspect they would have continued with that up until the point where there was an allergic reaction in the DA at all this that was happening. But then, fortunately, Donald Trump comes along and starts behaving like an enraged bull elephant at everything that the ANC has been doing. And I think that sort of that forced, it did something that John Steenhuisen was unable to do, and that's forced the ANC to significantly moderate its positions for the moment. So we're in this sort of moment where sort of things are kind of seeming to work a bit, with the government of national unity. Yeah, there are other points I'll make, but I think that those are the ones initially.
Frans, let's go to you.
Let me start on the ANC side, and then let's go to the Steenhuisen side. I think in the ANC, a few things have happened that they've sort of intersected. The first thing was obviously that it lost the election last year, and that forced it into a binary choice. It had to choose either the populist route, firmly and unambiguously, EFF and MK, or it had to pick the more centrist route, and it picked the more centrist route, and that kind of set it off on a bit of a trajectory. It had to make that choice. That's the first thing that's happened. Second thing that's happened in the ANC is there is a recognition that it lost that election because the economy performed poorly. And the economy performed poorly because its policies were hostile to investment. So now you've got two things happening at once. You've been kind of slung down this more centrist track than might have been the case before. And you recognize that at the heart of this thing is the weak performance of the economy. The third thing that I think has happened is that the very nature of the GNU itself, and particularly that strong stand the DA took on the VAT issue a few months back, to survive, it forces a degree of compromise on both sides. And so that's a third factor. So number one, you've made a choice that slung you down a more centrist track than you might otherwise have been on. Number two, you realize the economy is the reason for your poor political performance. And number three, you're starting to make a few compromises and concessions. And that leads to a fourth point that I think I've seen that I think is important. And that's, we think Ramaphosa goes at the end of 2027. Gwede Mantashe, there's talk now that he's saying he might pack it all in as well and not be around again. The old guard's kind of leaving. And for many of the old guard, Mr. Ramaphosa will be able to retire in reasonable comfort, you would think, and some of the others as well. And there's a younger guard of ANC leader who's coming up through the ranks, senior guys. It's a cabinet level or bout, and they're going to inherit all of this, and they start to think about what they should do with it and what's going to fall on their shoulders. And I think one thing they realize is that the future success of the ANC will be probably the single most influential thing in determining the future success of their own lives. These aren't people who've made it yet. They couldn't go and retire and the like. If the ANC falls apart completely, their career paths end. And I think those four forces coming together are a very interesting phenomena. And I think if you try to understand why did Mr. Ramaphosa get through this NGC meeting so easily, and we told you he would. We'd been telling clients who were worried about it. We said, no, the NGC, we said, no surprises, no shocks, and Ramaphosa gets through. And I think this, time is a wonderful thing. If you let these forces play out over time, they have a kind of calming, centralizing, moderating effect. And to some extent, I think that explains what happened in the NGC meeting. And also the point, I think we made it last week, it's worth making again, that the ANC threw out Mr. Mbeki and ultimately Mr. Zuma from a position at which they were confident they would pick the next president in parliament because they had a majority. They don't have that anymore. Maybe you make that the fifth factor here. And if they threw out Mr. Ramaphosa in a sort of fit of whatever, Parliament has to elect a new president, there's no guarantee that guy will be an ANC guy. And at the very least, even if it were, imagine the power you'd hand the DA, essentially a veto over who the leader of the ANC is. So I think that's why this NGC's turned out as it has. Let me just stop there on the ANC side. Maybe you want to go to something, and then I want to get back with John and to this question. I mean, with James, to the question of John Steenhuisen and the leadership of the DA, because there's actually quite a bit we want to say there that's quite kind of serious, I think.
Yeah, before that, maybe let's just finish talking about the NGC, because we've talked about what didn't happen, no revolt against Ramaphosa, but what did the NGC actually produce?
Well, it produced a series of resolutions, and I read them all this morning, and I've read most sort of ANC resolutions and conference declarations for 20 years. And these ones everyone starts with an aspiration. So a very good example was on energy. There'll be a strong statement or series of statements, series of paragraphs, and it will say we must have more electricity because this is the most important thing that there could be. Then if you sort of think of it, it's pretty much literally what happens. The next paragraph will say, and we're fully committed to the green transition and the just transition. And you start to think, but hell no, guys. If you want more energy and you want to go to green transition, you're now at a contradiction. Then it doubles down on the contradiction. The next paragraph will read, Namibia is doing terribly well in oil and gas. They're probably going to pump oil and gas within the next 4 years. And vast finds. Arguably, the Namibian finds are the largest offshore finds in history. And not African, West Coast history. They are vast. And that same oil and gas extends into South Africa's territorial waters, but we're not pursuing it because the oil majors have walked out because of BEE demands. And then the document goes on to say, we must correct this and we must exploit the hydrocarbons under the sea, and in fact build a fleet of power stations that will be based on these. And you kind of just step back from it and you say, what's going on here? You say we must have more electricity, we must do the green transition, and we must go mining for more fossil fuels. And throughout these, I reckon these resolutions together, I'd guess, are 10 or 20,000 words. So it's a long, it's detailed. It's not that it's abbreviated bullet points. At every single point, it's exactly that. It's this contradiction. I wrote 2 opinion pieces about it that will be published. And the way I phrased it is that the ANC is at war with itself in its own head about what to do. And that's not, that's if let's say you're a big ANC guy and you really care about the ANC and you understand its importance to the stability of South Africa, this will be quite disheartening for you. That even at this point, it can't bring itself to firmly commit to a track. But if, let's say, you're not a big ANC guy, you're sort of ANC critic and you think it's a terrible organization and it will be the end of South Africa, there's a contradiction here, not just one hard left trajectory. And you might look at that if you were very critical of the ANC and think, well, this isn't bad. Maybe there's a bit of pragmatism shining through. But in the end, our other friend, also Gabriel Krause, I credit with the statement that the ANC pursues 2 mutually annihilating objectives at the same time. And in the resolutions of its otherwise calm NGC meeting, it's every single page is an impossible contradiction between competing objectives that are both cast as items that the ANC wishes to simultaneously pursue.
Yeah, so I'm going to stay on the ANC track and kind of continue to expand on, you talked about forces in ANC decision making earlier, Frans. One of the big pieces of news out this week is that the ANC is unable to pay its staff again. So what kind of impact and influence over the ANC do you think this kind of slow crumbling of the organization that seems to be happening every now and again, what influence does that have on the decision makers inside of the ANC? And also then on top of that, does it limit their ability to enact, a reasonable strategy if they come to one?
Yeah, well, it's a few levels. One is, let's go start at contradictions. those same resolutions write at length about decent work and workers' rights and the importance of trade unions and let alone paying your staff. And literally outside the gate are the ANC staff picketing, supported by a trade union, saying, we haven't been paid. It's 2 weeks before Christmas. So there's the contradiction story. The second, almost as striking a thing, is how much income does the ANC get in a year? Don't know, you guys have it's about 1.5 to 2 billion rand a year. That's the income, and of that, more than half comes from taxpayers. There's this idea South Africans don't really know how political parties are funded. There's all this hype about private funding, regulate the private funding, but politicians vote grants for themselves through parliament and the provincial legislatures. And the ANC take of that annually is north of 1 billion rand. So how do you, I mean, if this is your budget, how are you possibly unable to pay the staff in your head office? I mean, it does speak to things that certainly the ANC is quite good in both in the conference documents before the conference and in the resolutions afterwards in saying it's quite honest. It says straight up, people don't trust us, they don't have confidence in us. We must rebuild the confidence. But when your own head office staff are protesting at the gate, and you're inside the meeting, you're declaring how workers' rights and decent work are your top priority. This does sort of go to the point of why people don't trust you much anymore. Gabriel?
James?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of contradiction again. I think the sort of not wanting to make choices is, they would have lost about a third of their state funding because of the election results. But they probably, didn't want to retrench anyone. So then you get into the next crisis as well. You then don't have enough money to pay the people that you didn't want to retrench. So I suspect that also contributes to the current predicament.
Certainly. And so we'll stay on the South African track, but switch our focus away from the ANC and towards the DA, because it seems as though as the ANC weakens, Ramaphosa's position only strengthens, but it seems that John Steenhuisen faces the opposite hurdle, where as the DA's position strengthens, his position weakens. So, James or Frans, which one of you want to go first on what's happening with John and the leadership struggle in the DA?
I think Frans should go lead on this.
Yeah. I want to say a few things. I don't know if I'll one day regret them, but here we go. It's an open story now. It's not even an open secret that John is under severe pressure inside the DA, and that there are moves to remove him, and that some of the people who are behind those moves, they make a series of arguments. Some of it is based on the sort of salacious stuff that's been in the press. I think they should be very careful about removing John. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. And then if I forget, I want to say something about how John could position himself. The first thing is that since this is the case for John Steenhuisen, and I mean, I've had my run-ins with John, I can assure you of that. But this is the case for John Steenhuisen. Since he became leader of his party, its support went up, not down. And it's polling as strongly as it ever has. So that's number one. Number two, his party is vying for control of Gauteng. It's now the strongest player there. And to win South Africa's biggest cities. Already has Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Pretoria conceivably can be won. This is not a minor achievement. His chief rival, the ANC, lost its control of the country under his watch. You can say who takes credit for it, but he was the guy that sat in the CEO's, or he's the head of the party seat. He got his party into the government, which if you speak to all the old liberals, which was the sort of background of the DA. He said to them one day, "You'll all be in the cabinet running the country." They'd sounded, even a few years ago, to many of them sounded far-fetched to those who sit in the cabinet, some of them, when they first got there. Since he's been in the government, essentially co-leading the country with Mr. Ramaphosa, things have got a little bit better through the influence of the Treasury, of which the DA has Deputy Minister of Finance. So both deputies are excellent, and I think the minister is also very, very good. We've had a very good budget under difficult circumstances. The Treasury is not responsible for the fact that the economy doesn't grow. It deals with the consequences. That triggered the first ratings upgrade in 20 years. South Africa's fixed investment number business confidence numbers can conceivably tick upwards somewhat. At the time of the GNU negotiations, I can remember one afternoon, John had been offered or the DA had been offered a particular cabinet position, and in practice that was unilaterally withdrawn. And he was in a very difficult position in his own party, and I thought he was very good in actually being the bigger man and not collapsing the whole thing on that, and actually going into the GNU deal, which I was an advocate of and remain. And I think in the 4 points I mentioned earlier, it's done a lot of good for the country. And of late, as James said, the difficult press John has had might rankle some people, but if you think a bit more broadly about it, what does it do? It establishes a kind of common ground, because the ANC gets this kind of press all the time. This kind of hostile, not undeserved often, hostile, snarling, sort of smirking media. Look at that ANC leader, what a moron. And this one, look what he's done, and that one. And now John's had the same kind of press. And you'll notice the ANC hasn't attacked him, because there's some kind of, I don't know if you call it an honor code or what, which kind of says that if the press is doing this to you about your personal life and whatever, you don't, we on the ANC side, they say we know what that's like. We get that all the time. Now you see the DA getting it. And what that creates, and I think this is incredibly important, is oddly enough, and somewhat counterintuitively, a degree of common ground between the ANC leader, the DA leader and parts of the ANC that the DA could not otherwise achieve with the ANC, and I'd be very, very wary of throwing that away. And I'd further say that if you look at potential successors for John, be very cautious that you're picking a person who one remains committed, for whatever the reasons are, to the GNU, not someone who's willing to walk out of that quickly, and also a person who can build on the kind of rapport that's been established with the ANC. Let's go on. I've made a long list of reasons. If you fire John, it would probably be in April of next year that DA has a conference. He might fight back. The party might be factionalized. And that's 9 months ahead, 8 months, 9 months ahead of the local government elections. And if the DA starts fighting with itself before those elections, the voting public, we know from the polling, they just hate this. And the DA has been so good in not doing that. And if they start it before the election, it will probably cost them the prospect of winning Johannesburg and Pretoria. More so for the fact that Helen Zille would have to divert herself from her Johannesburg campaign to go and sort out, the Iron Lady of the DA. She'd have to go and sort out the mess. If the thought is to position someone like Silje Brink, who's the greatest guy, as a DA leader, well, he's actually the Pretoria candidate. If it's Jordan Hill Lewis, he runs a city, and I would not at all be assured that city is entirely safe, given the challenge of Gayton Mackenzie. Well, let me quickly say something about Gayton. Last night, I thought he was wonderful because he was sent, it shows you the nastiness of the fighting in the DA. He was sent a printout of John's bank statements by a person in the DA, obviously in the hope that Gayton would publish these and share them. And Gayton made a great little video clip, and he said, you know what? He said, I've burnt them or shredded them, one of the two, because this isn't what I do. This isn't how we play the game. And that's very much the same point I was making to you about the sort of peculiar honor code around the ANC guys not going after John on this stuff. And Gayton then said the other point is don't think I'm an idiot and I don't play your game for you. So I don't care who the DA leader is. I'm certainly not going to involve myself in its politics. So I think what we say is and there are problems around the challenges around the leadership of the DA. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm just saying this is a moment to just think through the thing very, very calmly. And sometimes the best thing to do, even if you have an internal conflict, is for everyone to calm down and sit on their hands and see the bigger strategic picture and not go and do something rash, particularly at a moment when it's not clear that a candidate that you might, I don't know who the candidate would be, a candidate you might replace the chap with is not being properly thought through. So, Gabriel, there we go. I've said it.
So I think I'm going to go to you, James, but before I do, I want to add a question to what you're going to talk about for you to think about, which is imagine if the DA were to have gone into the GNU with not John Steenhuisen, but maybe someone like Tony Leon, someone who was a serial fighter who always made sure to pick the fight and go as hard as possible every time there was an opportunity. What do you think? Do you think that yields a better result for the DA come this time this year, a year and a bit in? Or do you think that actually the fact that John has been a lot more compromising, being willing to, work across the aisle, maybe is that not a better thing for the country overall?
Tony actually is an interesting guy because he recognized that there was a problem in the old PFP with how often there was a sense that in this is white politics in the 80s, that the sort of liberals sort of spoke in a way that came as speaking down to Afrikaners at the time. So when he became leader, he did very much the opposite, and he was able to actually make a breakthrough among Afrikaner voters that no other leader had ever achieved. So there's a similar challenge in this government of national unity. I wouldn't use Tony as the example, but imagine a really capable, sort of arrogant, well-educated, self-confident, very dynamic guy, who would have immediately sort of put the noses of the ANC up, and no matter how well he did in his ministry, probably would have led to this sort of reaction that would have seen the DA thrown out again in very short order. So the sort of low-key approach of John's has, it's obviously it's probably not the sort of textbook ideal, but it's allowed this government of national unity to sort of bed down gradually. I mean, I think there is it's not so much a John problem, but there's a structural problem, and it also afflicted the National Party in the first government of national unity. Is that if you sit in government, you sort of become part of the system, you become dependent on you're used to the perks, you become very attached to the to being a minister and all that entails. So I think it was in a way a mistake to have the leader inside the government of national unity. I think what the Freedom Front Plus did was very clever, which is dividing the two. You had your minister who could perform as a minister, but then you have your leader sitting outside of the GNU. I suppose, I think that was a major mistake of the DA initially. I think it caused them a lot of trouble, but I think even though it's not sort of formal, I think informally that's in the end what the structure they ended up adopting anyway. With the sort of leadership sitting outside and then the ministers, doing their job. Yeah, and just a final point, going back to what Frans says, I think one of the hardest things in politics is preventing your irritations from getting in the way of your objectives. And obviously, I think there's a lot of irritation with John, probably in many respects for good reason. But if you go ahead and you get into the sort of dirty kind of leadership kind of contest, which the DA seems to be on the brink of, you are going to cause serious harm to your objectives, and your objectives are trying to win Joburg and China next year.
Yeah, and on that point, I think it's worthwhile for me to maybe talk a little bit about what some of the polling indicates about voter beliefs inside of the ANC and the DA. And to preface this, the idea of the political parties working together has been the only kind of major political idea that has drawn any sort of majority of positive views. So even long before the election, in October of 2023, we asked a question which was along the lines of, the DA and the ANC have some differences, but really they're not that far apart. And if they could come together to work together, that would be the best thing for the country. And at that point, about 70% of all voters and 65% of ANC voters, 67% of DA voters agreed with this idea. And we saw this repeated across multiple questions, essentially asking the same thing. So politicians working cross parties together is a good thing in the eyes of the voters. Now we cut forward to happened in the GNU. So we asked a question immediately after the GNU was formed last year, in which we said, how well is the GNU performing? Is it doing well or poorly? And at that point, about 50% of 60% of voters said that the GNU was performing well. But then if you compare that to the party's performance, because we asked about how the ANC and DA are doing inside of the GNU, you get about, again, 60% of voters who think the ANC is doing pretty well, and 63% of voters who think the DA is doing well. Now we cut forward a year to our most recent poll from November, in which we asked the same questions. And now the support for the GNU has gone from about 60% to just below 50%. And this primary loss of support there comes from DA voters, really. So they don't like the GNU as much overall anymore. But ANC voters are still about the same position on the GNU overall. And then we ask, though, how well the ANC is doing inside of the GNU. And remember that last year, September, they're at 60%. This year, November, they're now at 40% who think they're doing well inside of the GNU, with only a majority of ANC supporters thinking that they're doing well inside of the GNU, not really anyone else. But the DA, who had also been just above 60% on their performance, remain at about 60% of people who think that they're doing well inside of the GNU. And so the damage that is being inflicted on the GNU image, because it's lost about 10 points from last year, seems to be damage inflicted solely to the ANC, because when you break it down, the DA remains at the same level of kind of performance support it was last year. And then you add to this, we have this kind of question that we asked later in the most recent survey. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? If the ANC and DA can form a majority in any municipality or metro after the next local government elections, they should do so and form a coalition together. So basically, are you in line with the principle that whenever the DA and ANC can work together, they do that? And now 60% of voters are in favor of that. But then you break it down by demographics, it's about 73% of ANC's voters are in support of that, and 59% of DA voters are in support of that. 65% of black voters are in support of that, and 52%, 42% of white voters are in support of that. So you take kind of all of these things together. People like the GNU, John being inside of the GNU has meant that the two parties found an easier way to kind of come together and work together. And the DA is maintaining a very positive image among South Africans by being inside of the GNU, but the ANC is seeming to lose some of its shine while it's in the GNU. So if you're sitting there as a DA strategist thinking now is the best time to seriously rock the boat, I've got news for you that the exact opposite is true. Continue what you are doing, have been doing, and you're likely to see more and more success because the trends bear that out. Continue to let the ANC struggle with, the kind of infighting, all of the things that we've talked about in this conversation, and you continue to just work, do your jobs, and you will come out looking very good. So that's kind of, yeah.
Tell
France?
me again, what is the November number on ANC voters who think the ANC is performing well in the GNU?
ANC voters who think the ANC is performing well in the GNU is about 63% of ANC voters.
Yeah,
And
so I just want to. There are a lot of numbers there that I'm slightly familiar with, but so one point I can make is that a strong majority, 6, 7 out of 10 voters, like the idea of the ANC and the DA working together. A second point I can make is that 6 out of 10 ANC voters think the ANC is doing well in the GNU. And a third point is that roughly the same 6 out of 10 DA voters think the DA is doing well in the GNU.
so actually slightly more. It's about 7 out of 10, 7.5 out of
7
10
out
for
of
the
10.
DA.
Okay. So, I mean, then the idea must be that for both the ANC and the DA, their participation in the GNU has met with sort of considerable welcome from their own support bases. When what I'm trying to get at, you said that there was a number that the ANC had lost the shine in the GNU. Just tell us again what that number was, but I didn't completely follow that part.
So the number is that about, I think it was 60% of voters in September of last year thought the ANC was doing well, of all voters, and now it's down to below 50%
Of all voters. Okay, so of
of all
all voters,
voters.
it's below 50, but of ANC voters, it's still above 60.
Exactly. So
Ah, I have it. I have it.
So
Yes.
that's why the point I was making was if you're a DA strategist, you look at that and go, "Oh, that's quite a good thing." Just by us the being inside of the GNU, we can let the ANC collapse, have some influence over the decisions that are taken in parliament, in government, and we don't really need to do much else because the ANC is fighting against itself, really. James?
Yeah, I mean, I think the DA played the budget very well, and I think they, in a sense, they were saved by Trump. But obviously, if the ANC were, pushing full ahead with all the national democratic revolution stuff that they were initially, then the GNU would become very toxic for the DA support base. So we're kind of in a sort of delicately balanced position right now. So the downside of the John approach is if he becomes seen as too much of a walkover by the ANC, which there were reports I think it was earlier this year, where they very much conveyed that message. And it was then the budget fight that gave the DA some credibility back. So it's a very delicate sort of path you have to take. You don't want to be seen as a walkover, because then you will be walked over, and eventually to a degree that your support base may desert you. But on the other hand, you have to sort of get along with these guys and not do something that brings the whole thing collapsing down and into a situation where the ANC sort of lurches into a relationship with MK or whatever. So it's very, very, very difficult and very balanced.
If John got a hard time early on for being very accommodating on things like Bella. And I mean, I think a lot of that criticism must be taken seriously. But the critics who say, the DA was weak on Bella, so the GNU isn't a great thing and they should walk out, must realize what the consequence of that is. You'll still have Bella, but this time Bella will be driven by MK and the ANC together. And you can make a really interesting argument that's a strategy you can follow. See if you can get the country to collapse very quickly and ANC support dissipates more rapidly and the DA can do well in future elections. But that's brinkmanship, and I mean we've thought through that and we don't think it's a good idea. But I think what James says, when people think about John and where he's at and everything, I mean the weight of responsibility of this and getting there at all and all of that is so great, and trying to get this balance just right is completely impossible. So you will stray to the wrong side of the line now and again. And if the guy wished to and looked at the whole situation, could easily write a story about him, that he was the DA leader that, if you were to write the story, brought down the ANC, got his party into government, started the process of national recovery, rivaled, took it to its highest polling, challenged them in the major cities. If you want to write a good story about John, and the guy who sits at the top is in the end the guy who carries the responsibility, and therefore is also entitled to take some of the credit. And if John wanted to write that story about himself, he'd be entitled to do so. And I think look back on some of what's been done with a sense of real achievement despite everything.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to leave our discussion on South Africa for this week. And we're going to now turn internationally. And Simon, you've been waiting incredibly patiently. Thank you very much. And we're coming to you because you're going to tell us about private equity in the United Kingdom.
Sure, Gabriel. Hi. So I think private equity is a great way to examine the British economy, because you don't have to look at things like borrowing costs or productivity levels or tax burdens. And if you have a look at private equity, particularly over the last decade, you get to see confidence, you get to see conflict, especially where capital meets society's vulnerable points. And just for the benefit of our audience, private equity is obviously investment in companies that are not publicly traded stocks. Ordinarily, institutional investors pool their money to buy stakes in companies. And the process initiated by private equity is to grow those companies to a point where they can be sold. And I think that private equity as a term would have probably become more of a household name in South Africa in the mid-2000s. Look, it's been in America. Obviously, it's an enhanced form of American capitalism. But in the mid-2000s, you started seeing something very interesting from a company called Blackstone, which is today the largest alternative investment manager in the world. And what Blackstone did, specifically with its EU deal, which was a property portfolio founded by a guy called Sam Zell. And Sam Zell was the child of Polish Jewish immigrants who, by the age of 18, was already turning over $160,000 a year. This is in the 60s. The guy's a machine. And he's considered the father of the modern real estate investment trust, or REIT. Now, in the mid-2000s, Blackstone got a hold of him and said, look, we'll take what you have. And subsequently, the EQ, which is the Equity Office deal, was the largest at the time, and it was $36 billion. And what Blackstone, it wasn't just the amount, it was the prescience. They had the financial collapse coming. They were able to see that if they got this done quickly and got out soon enough, they would make a fortune. And it was one of these tremendous wealth generating exercises. So that's just a little intro into private equity. Now, if you take the UK, it isn't good. Not much is, but private equity, if you compare it to year on year, 2024 was a bad year, but 2025 has seen a quarter decline in the amount of deals that have been done. That's a lot. Okay, you've got as it relates to private equity mergers and acquisitions, you've gone from 45 billion in 2024 to 12 billion. Now, that's mitigated somewhat by funding rounds that have improved, but nowhere near to a compensatory level. And I think the best way to lead the rest of the discussion here is to give you the best case of my best case of private equity in the UK, and then juxtapose it with the worst. So I've got a personal interest in this, which is just geographic, really, because the best private equity deal that I consider executed in the UK involved a little shop on my high street. And that was in 1983. A dude called Jeffrey Hyman starts selling coffee and sandwiches from his little shop. Lovely product, terrible businessman. Within 18 months, thing is underground, and from the liquidator, two guys, one called Sinclair Beecham and the other guy called Julian Metcalf, they buy the intellectual property, including the branding, and the name is Pret-a-Manger, okay, which is now ubiquitous, but that was the origins. And from 1986 until 2001, these guys turbocharge Pret. Locations suddenly go from 3 to 17 to 30, and 2001, McDonald's comes along and says, we're going to buy a 33% non-controlling stake in Pret. And that allows them to grow even faster, and they start developing internationally. Come 2008, this private equity starts getting involved. And it's a spin-off of NatWest Bank. It's called Bridgepoint Capital. And Bridgepoint Capital go, right, McDonald's will take that off you. And the deal was initially valued at 450 million pounds, but cleverly they reduced that to 345 million pounds. And they did that because they saw the headwinds coming across from America. Remember 2008, Bear Stearns, not a great feeling. But that money, coupled with the founders' commitment to doubling down on their own investment, saw a massive expansion. Footprint went from Europe to Hong Kong to the US, where they had something like 70. I think they've still got 74 venues in the States. And their first one was in New York. And suddenly 2008 turns into 2018, and a German conglomerate called JAB comes along and goes, we'll take it from you for 1.5 billion. So you've got something that went for 345 million. 10 years later, it's 1.5 billion. The deal was probably a bit more, about 5x. And everyone is thrilled. It's a great case study. It's a fantastic product. It's still regarded as being the healthiest high street option, much more so than its competitors. And the founders very wisely put together a little charity, a foundation tackling hunger and homelessness. And I think to date that's sort of generated £8 or £9 million. But the sweetener was for every single Pret employee, they got 1,000 cash in their back pocket. So this is the type of thing that you take to your green scumtard and you go, you do one better, do one better. But where it goes wrong is the use case of Thames Water, utility. So in the 90s, the debt to equity ratio within utilities was around 4%. Today, it's in some cases 90%. 2006, Macquarie leads Macquarie private equity out of Sydney, Australia, leads a consortium, and they take Thames Water, which services a quarter of British households. And we're looking at a situation now where Britain's rivers are in such a poor state that you have to ask, where did that money go? Because it certainly didn't go to upgrading infrastructure. Admittedly, there's been a huge rise in number of people using pipes, but the infrastructure is shot. And if you look at what happened, you can see that Thames Water was simply loaded with debt, recapitalization debt, and the stakeholders, the investors were paid, and Macquarie was able to extract extravagant fees. And it's during this time that people like Warren Buffett or Luke Johnson, who's a prominent British entrepreneur, come out and say, well, private equity is just a mask for generating fees, extracting fees. Excuse me. And that's why today it is considered very unpopular here, honestly. And that's because it's not just water. If you look at some of society's most vulnerable institutions, you're looking at assisted care facilities and special needs schools, all of which private equity has been involved in. And now, they don't do things properly there, because you've got a care facility that suddenly starts buying food by the bulk, and then from its Turkish distributor, it buys a dodgy lettuce, and the next thing, there's one dicky tummy turns into like a wave of arse-spraying mayhem in an institution where people are already vulnerable, okay? And then it's the same with special needs. You can't get temporary agency workers paid on minimum wage to deal with very sensitive cases. So private equity's rap is not at the golden year perception that it was with the Pret deal, and it's at the moment a little bit in the dog box. But here's the thing, and I think that there are two ways of looking at the future of the UK. You can do what I did earlier, and you could watch Prime Minister's questions, and you could see the dull expressions on the front bench of Labour. They have no idea what's going on. They are so way out of their depth, and they are seething at the response to this budget that was announced 2 weeks ago. Or you can see it through the eyes of people like Jamie Dimon, he's an investment banker, or Stephen Schwarzman, who's the founder of Blackstone. Now, Stephen Schwarzman is about a third of the way through completion of the Blackstone office in Mayfair off Berkeley Square. It's a phenomenal investment. And you ask the question, why did you do that if the outlook for Britain isn't good? And you could ask the same question for Jamie Dimon. Why did you select London as a campus for JP Morgan when you could have chosen Frankfurt or Paris? And the answer to that question is because those guys don't think in the present. They think 10 years from now. And that's where the money guys are thinking. And within that 10-year scenario, they have made a series of quite radical assumptions. The guys that I speak to in private equity, and I speak to them quite often, I'll come back to what they tell me, but on the subject of living in the future, they have made the assumptions that Britain has a pretty radical set of policies that it has implemented, one of which is remigration. The other one is a complete collapse of the welfare apparatus as it exists at the moment. These things are gambles. There's no guarantee that this is going to happen, but these are the ways that they're seeing the future. So if you want to have a positive view on Britain, then you could do a whole lot worse than reading the frequent thoughts of Stephen Schwartzman or Jamie Dimon. But to explain perhaps those statistics that I read out about the activity and performance, the guys that I speak to say to me that there's no way to shield from the impact of global rhythms. You're going to have to feel the vibrations somewhere, and these are prompted by events in eastern Ukraine. They're prompted by the decline of industry in certain places, the uncertainty of the AI bubble, the China, and so on. So unless your portfolio is 100% uncorrelated, which it can't be because there's not enough, so you are going to feel it. So that's the first thing. But the second is very interesting, and that is almost like self-sabotage. They hiked national insurance in the UK. And what does that do? Okay, it loads the cost of doing business. So business has the option of continuing under pretty undesirable circumstances or just shuttering. And when companies shutter, private equity can't look to invest in them. That's just the simple explanation. But as to conclude this part, I think that there are hugely technical references within private equity, leverage buyouts, for example, that may not be as accessible as the other areas of studying economic activity. But for our audience, if you want to know about success stories and taking risks that pay off, and the ability to see in the future, I would strongly recommend that you read Stephen Schwartzman's biography. I think it was published in about 2017, and it makes for his career and the decisions he made, particularly setting up the academy in China, very, very interesting. But as I said, it's a very interesting way of seeing the UK economy. And if you are someone who is not averse to risk, then seeing the future of this country through these guys is quite a fulfilling exercise. I would say that there's no guarantee that you'll be able to undo these obstacles that the Labour Party seem very keen on leaving behind. But this future that these guys have envisaged is really quite compelling. Over to you, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. To you, Frans.
I've got a few questions for you. Why is, other than, you've sort of hinted at it, why is the volume, the number of private equity deals down so sharply in the UK?
Well, I think it's because of the conditions are it's not easy to do business here. It's not easy to find the right deals. KKR, which is one of the largest original American private equity firms, completed the largest deal of the year, which I can't remember the name of it was a tech deal. By standards previously, it wasn't blow your hair back stuff. And a lot of these guys are feeling that it's just not, the conditions are just not right. The political conditions, the economy is sort of really, really pedestrian. And when you have that, that the impacts are felt.
And now the next one, the number of IPOs, of listings,
Yeah.
in London is very sharply down over a prolonged period of time. I think by about half. And I think as a share of IPOs, London 20 years ago had about 20% of global IPOs, and I think that's down to 1% today.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, because it's not a desirable location to list your business anymore. And I think if you can go back more recently to 15 years, you remember Ivan Glasenberg listing Glencore in 2011. which was a fabulous wealth creation exercise. And during that era, just after the financial crisis, things were rocking and rolling, and there were 100 that year. There've been 13 so far. There is supposedly there's meant to be an uptick next year, but the economy, the Labour came out with streamers and Roman candles the other day to say, oh, our growth outlook has been upgraded from 1.2% to 1.3%. Look, I think that's worth getting excited about if you're a developing place, and that's great. But that's nothing compared to what it was, and you expect more. But Frans, as I said, like the guys that are the big shots, their vision is a lot more enthusiastic than the guy who's looking at his surroundings and just seeing decay.
That was the next this 10-year view
Yeah.
on London. Why? What is the upside view? What is the what underpins that? Why does it come right?
Well, it's largely based on the radical implementation, and that assumes that the Labour government has either collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity, or it's been forced into an early election by economic metrics. And in that case, a government comes in that is much more pro-business, and that has a series of measures that tackle the weight of the welfare that is imposed upon the economy, which is staggering. And when that frees that up, then it looks to start attracting the right talent, and you get the confidence back in the property markets, all of those sorts of things. So it is a gamble. I don't know, I'm in no position to comment whether that's a realistic prospect, because these guys have much better access to trends. But this is the sentiment coming from people like Jamie Dimon and Steve Schwartzman, and I think it should be paid attention to.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it just a gamble. I think the pendulum swinging isn't a gamble. I think if you double down on policies that depress the living standards of people sufficiently long and cause sufficient public frustration, you can create a political movement on the opposite extreme of the administration of the day. And if you, from what you've told us over the weeks on this show, if you create an administration in the UK that is the opposite of what it is today, you actually do have a very exciting, enticing proposition that lies on that sort of, whatever it is, 10-year horizon.
Correct. Private equity was attracted to Britain by three major incidents. First was the financial crisis. You buy things in a fire sale. Second was the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union in 2016, and third was the pandemic and the valuation being a lot less, and cost of doing business a lot less. I support, but Frans, some of the measures that these guys are looking at as realities, by the time Labour is replaced, the assumption is that Britain will have not just left the European Union, but it will have left the European Court of Human Rights, which is is seen now as a major obstacle to policy implementation, certainly as it relates to having the right sort of people here. I mean, the right sort of people, you know what I mean.
Yeah, just a small comment on that. I think it's quite interesting to hear the potential upside, because what's been very interesting to watch is that the Green Party, which you've mentioned before on this show, Simon, is now the most popular party in polls on the left. But the Green Party is run by a man with a series of entirely absurd populist left ideas. And the Labour Party is implementing an entirely absurd populist left agenda. And so you play that out, and Labour's kind of lost its position on the left because of implementing this agenda. But I don't think the average voter in the United Kingdom, if you let this play out for long enough, is going to be particularly enticed by either offering, because Labour will say, well, not like Zach Polanski, we're a little bit more moderate, but they act like Zach Polanski. And Zach Polanski says, I'm going to be even more extreme than Labour. Don't worry, you ain't seen nothing yet. I think that provides an opportunity where even if you have this fractured right between Reform and the Conservatives, the vote share on the left is just so low that you get a kind of complete rightward sweep. And maybe you could have a big upside of a Reform at say 35 to 40% and Conservatives at 20 to 25%, and a coalition between the two that the Conservatives moderate maybe some of the more statist excesses of Reform, and Reform is more aggressive on some of on the social issues, and you actually get the Jamie Dimon, Stephen Schwartzman scenario.
Yeah, I think that's and that's where, funnily enough, Nigel Farage, who's the leader of Reform, he's been around the block. He's seen things in Europe. He's studied the post-Thatcher era, and he's played it, in my view, very cleverly. And now they're getting him, the same people that write nasty articles about Afrikaners on the BBC are calling him a member of the Hitler Youth in the UK, and saying that he was goose-stepping around Dulwich College in South London when he was a kid. And it's getting to that level of stupid, which indicates that they're threatened, because you don't say stuff like that. And what I admire about the way that he's gone about it is he's letting everyone else fall into their own stupidity. So on Question Time, which is a BBC flagship program on Thursday nights last week, Zach Polanski, okay, by the way, a friend of mine says that he should be sectioned under the Dental Health Act. Just when you look at him, you'll see. But anyways, so he says on Question Time, the jobs in care, in assisted care facilities, basically for old people, they are taken by immigrants because a lot of the work involves wiping people's bums. So it's basically like saying, like, I don't want to wipe someone's bum, that a slave must come over and do that. He said it on television. So the more Farage plays this game of quiet accumulation, and that number stretches from 38 to 39 into the early 40s, and the prospect of that 10-year Jamie Dimon, Stephen Schwartzman thing becomes a reality. But that is, what you're seeing now isn't the worst of what the opposition can do. And these guys, these Labour guys, they might look a bit stupid, but I promise you they want to hold power, and they're going to do anything that it takes to keep it.
What Gabriel doesn't say when he introduces the show, just quickly, and he speaks with authority on the UK stuff, because the show is actually hosted from London, which is where Gabriel lives. He's one of the South Africans scattered around the world. I'm the one that's in Johannesburg, but the rest are out, and that includes Gabriel. So he has a very good vantage point of events in the UK.
Yes, thank you, Frans. But I think we'll turn on that point. We're going to turn away from my vantage point towards a country that we haven't given much love and attention to, despite its importance, and that is China. And Frans, you're going to be telling us about a couple of very important Chinese economic developments. So do you want to take us through that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things that are worth us talking about. One is that Standard Bank in South Africa, a week or two ago, adopted China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. Now, what CIPS is the Chinese rival to the SWIFT system, which these systems allow transactions to happen between financial institutions around the world. And SWIFT you might think of as a Western payment system. And if you're cut off from something like SWIFT, you can't transact financially at all. You're completely paralyzed. And after the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, which I word differently to the Russian invasion, the West made what I think was a terrible strategic mistake. To punish Russia, they cut it off from the SWIFT system, and they said, we'll show you. We'll cut you off, and you can't transact. And amongst others, our friend Davy Ruot was marooned in Russia. His credit card didn't work anymore because of this. This sort of thing happened. And it was a terrible mistake because it created, well, from a Western perspective, it created a strategic opportunity for China. Because probably the most important thing in the world to watch about who will control the world through the rest of your lives, if you listen to this, is the battle between China and America over the global reserve currency. And China's, I'd say, single most important strategic objective is to displace the dollar as the global reserve currency. Because if it achieves that, it fatally weakens the United States. And the reason is that if the US is a reserve currency, it can print away its deficit without too serious a consequence. But you can't do that if you're not a reserve currency. So if it's no longer a reserve currency, it can't print its deficit away, causes a domestic economic crisis. Second thing the dollar as a reserve currency allows America to do is to lend money to other countries. And anyone that borrows money from someone knows that who you borrowed the money from has leverage on you. And if the dollar falls away as the reserve currency, America can't lend, and its arguably primary foreign policy tool is disabled. And if you think about America not having the dollar as a reserve currency, both from its domestic economic situation and its global influence, it is a much diminished global power. And in the relative order of things, China's influence rises. Now, what do you need to be if you want to be a reserve currency? You need two things. You need a vast stockpile of gold. And China has been developing one. The figures that are reported are probably an undercount, but it's enormous. The trend line of Chinese gold buying, and it's becoming moving towards a number, whatever the number is, that could anchor such a currency. The second thing you need is you need a payment system that works in your currency that can't be disabled by the other side. And when the West cut Russia off from SWIFT, it didn't just cause a problem in Russia. It caused a global problem because anyone that traded any other country realized the West are going to use this payment system as a weapon against us. And we are very vulnerable and we better move to something else. And that accelerated the uptake of the Chinese SIP system. And it was therefore of enormous significance that South Africa's Standard Bank adopted the SIP system about a week ago. It's a huge step on Africa in favor of China ultimately wresting geostrategic control of the continent from its Western rivals. And it wasn't understood here at all for how important it was.
Thanks, Frans. And the second thing that you're going to tell us about is that China's had a good record goods trade surplus. So maybe tell us what that means.
The stories along the same lines. In November, China recorded a goods trade surplus. So that's the difference between the goods it exports and the goods it imports, of over $1 trillion. And it is the first time that number has been reached at that point in the year, 11 months into the year. And what is so particularly striking about this record number is that it happens in the year that the US sought to tariff and sanction Chinese exports. The US idea was we'd tariff much of the world and we'd use that as leverage, and a particular target was China that was threatened with these higher and higher tariffs. And in fact, what has happened through that year is that China experienced a just under 6% year-on-year increase in goods exports. And it did so despite, let me just call up exactly the number, a 28% fall, 29% fall in shipments to the United States. And what China has done should worry Western thinkers and Americans in particular. It built alternative markets very quickly, and it has continued to invest in tech and efficiency in manufacturing and industrial capacity. That means that it can sail through a year of US tariffs and come out on the other side much stronger than before. And if you are an American strategist thinking you can push back the Chinese economy and its export manufacturing capacity, you have to think twice, because it's won this year. It beat you. It beat you at your own game. You're in fact inheriting a whirlwind of cost pressures in the US that now rank as the number one political issue in that country. And China's got these record numbers. The growth came across industries of what they exported. And very strong growth into Europe, very strong growth into broader Southeast Asia as well. So these two stories go quite nicely together. That as we spoke now with Simon's stuff on London about if you look at the immediate situation, you have a particular view, but if you position in the longer term, just on these two examples that I've cited for you, you would have to begin to think that maybe China is getting the upper hand or has an upper hand in the struggle for global dominance over the next 20 or 30 years. Gabriel.
So, Frans, sorry, Simon, to you first.
Frans, I wanted to ask you, in your day-to-day work outside of the common sense, are you seeing any appetite for the Americans in Africa?
Yeah, I think so. I think broadly in Africa, yeah. I mean, Trump this week did the peace pact in the DRC. That's something the South Africans couldn't pull together. And Americans are quite bullish about their interests in a lot of Africa. From South Africans are surprised to hear that, because the relationship here is so toxic and has been so very difficult that South Africans, sometimes they're very insular and provincial in their view. They think, well, the whole world has the same issue with Trump that we do, and the whole of Africa, we're all aligned. And actually not. America's making great progress in trade and investment pacts in a lot of the continent. On the South African side itself, we've in last week, there were a few discussions about this with some people about how to get the relationship right. And we were asked for advice on why the relationship's gone wrong. And we said, well, there are three reasons for that. There are people in South Africa who want the relationship to go wrong, sort of sinister political actors. But luckily, they're very few and they can be dealt with. The second group are people who think that Trump is a complete lunatic, and there's no reasoning with the man. Nothing can be done. We must resign ourselves to our fate. And I actually heard an extremely prominent business leader say this from the stage in the last month, that we have to write off the US now. It's the end. There's nothing we can do. He's mad. We just get on without him. And so they're the people who want the relationship to be sabotaged. They're the people who don't think the relationship can be fixed. And then they're the third group, the people who've been trying to fix the relationship, but they've been doing it in completely the wrong way. And the advice we provided was, you can deal with group one. Group two can be convinced that the US has real material interest in having a successful relationship with South Africa. And group three just needs to get its analysis and strategy right, and we'll sort out this problem with the Americans quite quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, Frans. We'll stay, though, on the topic of America as we come to you for our last story of this week, which is the change to the US national security strategy. So if you want to briefly take us through that and its relevance, and you've kind of hinted at some of the Africa stuff, but yeah.
Well, the US came out this week with a new national security strategy, which they do from time to time. And it sort of guides its policy to the rest of the world. It's not just a narrow security, it's a broad understanding of security. So you could think it's its foreign policy strategy. And I'll make 2 points. At an overarching level, it's quite a departure from the old neoconservative liberal order. In the simplest terms, the old neocons believed in free trade and free speech, and everything that went with that, and that was to some extent the underpinning of their foreign policy. The new Americans, the policy reflects what should be called and is being called post-liberalism. And the central post-liberal thesis, as I understand it, is that free speech and free trade are crazy because you're just handing advantages to your enemies, platforms to attack you from, and economic advantages. And we need to return to a much more conservative sort of ethno-nationalist approach to the world. And that is littered through this document. But it's a part on Africa that I'll read to you. And it's not very long, because Africa doesn't get much attention. And what the Americans write on their policy to Africa, and this is what the South Africans need to start to understand. It's for far too long, the document goes, American policy in Africa was focused on providing and spreading liberal ideology. The United States should instead look to partner with select countries to ameliorate conflict, foster mutually beneficial trade relationships, and transition from an aid paradigm to an investment and growth paradigm capable of harnessing Africa's abundant resources and latent economic potential. And that's actually quite good. And then it stresses that, again, the US should transition from an aid-focused relationship to a trade and investment-focused relationship. And I was told by a senior American diplomat earlier this year that our ambassadors, American ambassadors to Africa, are going to be judged on one thing in the main. How many deals did you do, and what was the value of those deals? And when I speak about the third group of South Africans that don't understand, that are trying to fix the relationship but don't know how, they this is an early piece of advice for them. And it marks probably the most significant US policy shift, both globally in this turn from the neocon order to the post-liberal order, and to Africa, and saying we're not going to spread liberal ideology anymore. We're going to spread trade and investment, and we're going to do deals with you. And if I was Africa, I would happily swap the former for the latter. I think it's in the continent's best interests. Gabriel.
Thank you, Frans. That is a great place to leave it for this week. So thank you for everyone for tuning into this week's episode, and thank you so much to our esteemed panel for your contributions. And ladies and gentlemen, remember to tune back in next week to catch another episode of South Africa and the world's best news podcast. While you're waiting for next week's episode, ladies and gentlemen, make sure to go to thecommonsense.co.za, because we are not just a podcast, we are also a new media platform. And you can find many of the stories that we've talked about today and much more on thecommonsense.co.za. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense.